What's up everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ariana and I've been talking a lot about photography here on my channel, whether that is film photography or digital photography with Olympus or Fujifilm gear. So it's been a little bit since I've sat down to film a video, and part of it is life has just been really crazy past few weeks, and YouTube has just taken a little bit of a backseat in my life. I thought an interesting video would actually be to go through some of my favorite images on Instagram and break down the best compositions. And one of the great things that I love about the concept of composition in general is just the fact that you can have a great image come out of any camera, whether that's a 50-year-old film camera or 12 megapixel iPhone, or a big full frame DSLR or mirrorless camera. There's just a ton of different things you can do with composition, and like I said, at the end of the day, composition, in my opinion, is one of the most important features of any kind of photo, and it really is what makes or breaks a photo. And so today I wanted to touch upon kind of the 5 main things that I really do focus on when it comes to taking photos, and then just going through my Instagram and showing you examples of each of these different types of compositions. One thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon before I started were just a few of the basics when it comes to composition. And there's so much that can be said about composition, so really this video is not comprehensive at all, which is why I really wanted to narrow it down specifically to something like my Instagram feed. But before I begin, the main things are kind of the basics. The first is simply when it comes to symmetry and where you are positioning the subject of your photos. So this is pretty obvious when it comes to portraits. Your subject is kind of who or what perhaps you're taking a photo of, and in this case I am the subject in this frame, and then where you want to position your subject in relation to the frame. So when it comes to landscape photography, this is not always the most obvious. A lot of times with landscape photography you're dealing with foreground and background and layers versus kind of a specific subject and background. But even with landscapes, there's kind of a key focal point that your eye will typically go to. Maybe it's a tree that's standing out, maybe it's a lake, maybe it's simply a horizon line, and that's just your key signifying feature of the photo. Basically, the main place to start, where I start, is figuring out where I want the subject to be in relation to the photo. So people really talk about the golden ratio, and that's really if I were to divide my frame into thirds, both vertically and then both horizontally. I think I'm doing a pretty okay job doing it on camera, but that's kind of where you would have the lines. And basically what has been said, and this is what I was taught like in high school photography basics, but people's eyes will kind of get drawn to where those lines intersect. So there's kind of 4 points where the lines intersect, and it's almost like within thirds of the photo. Now, one thing that I actually listened to that I thought was really interesting was one of the points that Annie Graham made, who is an elopement photographer, and she was saying how with Instagram, a lot of the kind of framing of a subject and whatnot has really turned to the center of an image when it comes to posting on Instagram, because Instagram was so largely like square photos for a very long time. A lot of people kind of, with the square, it's just the center of the photo, whether it's kind of the way I'm framed now, or like the center, or framing along the center but up and down in that square, or left and right but still centered. So a lot of it revolves around the center kind of axes. I've actually found that I do both. I love the golden ratio, but a lot of times I find that having the center is actually just very much aesthetically pleasing, and especially when posting on Instagram or social media, I find that the center for some images just works a lot better. The second point is just my basically universal rule when it comes to having any kind of lines in photos. I always flatten it and make it, you know, 0 degrees. With photos, super easy to rotate your photo. I don't really care how I take the photo as long as it's kind of close to having the horizon line straight, or, you know, if I'm working with trees, having the trunk straight. And then I will edit in post-production if I need to tilt it a few degrees left or right. I try to make everything look straight and not like you're looking at the world kind of tilted like this. That's kind of the basics that I want to get out of the way. Those are my hard and fast rules. It's always a given. But from there really are a few different types of compositions that I really like. They're not always the same. But things that I like to look for when I'm out taking photos, especially when taking landscapes. I think landscapes can be really difficult to compose because there's just so many ways to make it either look really basic, like anyone just took it with their iPhones, or like going to, I always mention this, but summiting a mountain and just taking a generic photo that anyone else would take. Another thing is just finding like cool little compositions or pictures in landscapes that you may not think are really grand and extravagant, kind of like finding cool places to shoot in your own backyard. Just items like that, these compositions really help for, because those are definitely struggles that I find that I face when shooting landscapes. So this is definitely focused towards landscapes. The first thing is the out of focus foreground. I've posted a few of these within carousels, which are basically kind of like when you can swipe and have multiple photos in one post. I've posted some of these with their photo counterparts of having either the foreground in focus or having the foreground out of focus. And I've done a few of like these, which one do you like betters? So a lot of time I do get comments saying that they actually prefer the more traditional route of the foreground is in focus and the background is blurred out. This again is something that you're going to deal with more if you're shooting on a wider aperture in landscapes. Usually people do not, so everything's going to be in focus. That's kind of the landscape rule. It's not really a rule, but it's kind of a rule. And so that's something that you usually don't have to worry about. For me personally, I actually really like finding a foreground object to position my photo around. So for example, this photo I actually took, I'm gonna pop up, at Mount Rainier National Park, and again posted this in a carousel with a photo that the tree is actually in focus with the background out of focus. But really, there was no interest for me in the tree itself. It was the background that I really wanted to kind of show the beauty of. So I actually focused on the background instead. And before people ask, like, why did you not just have a larger aperture value and have everything in focus? The reason is actually because I was shooting on a very cloudy day and I was shooting film, so you know my ISO was a little bit limited to the box speed of the film, on top of the fact that again it was a very cloudy day, and so I didn't want to have too slow of a shutter speed where my hands were shaking and would cause motion blur, so I like to shoot wide open. I actually really like the way that in out of focus foreground frames the background or the main part of the landscape a lot nicer. For example, in this photo that I took on a recent hike that I did, I actually had the branch almost like frame the background and show this perspective of like peeking through, with the background, which is the part that I wanted to see, in focus. And so as you can see, if I were to carousel it to the right to the next photo that I posted, having it without that branch framing up the photo was almost a little more boring. And lastly, I'm just gonna show having this photo with one of the peaking things. I don't even know what they're called, but at the beach. Now, one of my fiance's friends actually mentioned that the foreground object was actually a little bit too much in the photo composition wise, and I totally agree now that I look back on it. But basically the concept is I care more about the background than this like metal piece of item, And so I still want something that will frame it up nicely, give it a unique perspective of, hey, look, this is not just a random beach background. This almost like I'm standing at the pier looking through this object kind of photo. I should have planned this video out a lot better than I actually did before I started trying to explain things. So the next type of composition is what I call a frame within a frame, and that is basically being able to frame up an image using something in the landscape that acts as another frame. It again gives that illusion that you're peeking through something at the landscape. So for example, this is on a hike in Banff National Park near Moraine Lake. Some parts of the hike you could see through the really tall trees to see the mountain range on the other side of the lake from you. And I think, again, this gives a really cool perspective of peeking through that tree line versus just having a wide open mountain landscape that, you know, maybe more people would take that exact same photo. Another example of this was, again, back in Mount Rainier National Park, or Rainier. I say Rainier, my sister who actually lives out there says Rainier. Basically, you know, having this typical peak that anyone might take a photo of, but framing it up with the trees around it is like you're peeking through the trees to see this grand peak. Another thing that I actually found really cool, which is a combination of this point of the frame within a frame, but then also almost like point number one of the out of focus foreground, was when I took a picture of Mount Rainier from downtown Seattle, and I did this while peeking through the wire, is it barbed wire or something like that, the fence, and had the fence out of focus, but the peak and the water / background in focus, and it frames it up in a different way, and it almost gives you like a composition to base your photo out of. So this next photo is a photo that I took on somewhat of a recent hike. I did make a video about this because it was shot on a vintage lens, so check out that video. Basically, I found this spot and this was kind of like I had no option except to do this because I was literally standing on like a little island. I had to jump over to this little island to be able to center myself with the river, and there were trees and branches in the way, so I was almost like forced to peep through them. But with the focal length of the vintage lens, I actually got this cool view of the branches framing the photo, so now you have that frame within a frame. Okay, so a few more frame within the frame type of photos, just these film photos that I took of the George Washington Bridge, being able to take a very generic photo that people would normally take of just the bridge itself at the perspective that I was at, but all I did was like crouch down lower and use these cracks between the rocks to actually frame out the photo. It leads your eye directly to where you want it to go, which is the bridge, but it's almost like that peaking feeling of just adding a cool perspective that you wouldn't normally get if you just took a picture of the bridge by itself. Next is lots of layers. This is something that I really love playing with. So the first photo that I immediately thought of when I thought of just layers on layers on layers was actually this view of the New York City skyline. And again, the New York City skyline is something that is so overdone, especially if you live in my area, which is the tri-state area. And so this was actually a cool photo that I loved the way it came out, not only from like the color tones of the sky, it was during golden hour, well, it was like golden hour going into blue hour, but the fact that there are so many layers in this image. And this is something that you really achieve out of a telephoto lens, is being able to compress all of those layers and get really, really cool landscapes from that effect that the telephoto lens has on it. Pretty much all of these layered photos are taken with somewhat of a telephoto lens, and that's kind of wise because that's what gives it the illusion. Just adds more interest to the photo because there's just like things that you pick up each time you look at the photo that's new. So this one I really like because obviously you have the skyline, which is clearly the main part of the image, like that's where your eye immediately goes to first, on top of the fact that it is literally being illuminated by the sun. But then as you start looking at the image more, whether that's going back to the image and re-looking at it. There's just so many things that you start picking up with the foreground, layered with the trees, layered with the homes closer to the city itself, and then you finally get to the city, and then you have the sky on top of that too. So many layers compressed together makes for such an interesting photo. Another photo of the city skyline taken with the same lens, my 90mm from Fujifilm. Very cool, like layered compression, and then on that same carousel you actually see another view of the New York City skyline. Clearly I've taken a lot of New York City skyline photos, but again, that compression and those just like layers stacked on top of each other is something that I really love about the telephoto lens. But like now, knowing that that's the effect that it gives is something that I try to purposely achieve. Another thing, again, taken with the exact same lens but more in a traditional landscape, like nature perspective, you have all these mountains, and then you have the peak like closer to you, you've got the lake, and then obviously the trees coming up to the peak that you're on closer to you. All of that is just compressed and stacked together, so you have so many different layers to the photo, but it's like this two-dimensional item that you're looking at with so many different dimensions within it, and I think that's just such a cool perspective. Two more. These were both taken on medium format film. Again, Mount Rainier National Park. Just the layers of the trees and the branches, and it worked out well because the ones in the foreground are bare, and then you have like the more condensed bare ones, the greenery, and then the mountain range at the top, and all of those layered together in one photo that you can just see, and your eye goes to something different every single time you look at it, or the longer you look at it. Lastly, also taken on my Fuji GS645S medium format camera, not in the park, outside of the park, but still in the Pacific Northwest, which is so beautiful. Self-explanatory, but so many different layers, so many different parts of the photo that you see every time you look at it, and it's all stacked together in one two-dimensional photo. So clearly I like my layered photos because I talked about this one for a very long time. Okay, so next I wanted to talk about reflections. Reflections is something that I like to take advantage of when I'm presented with the opportunity, because I am not always presented with the opportunity of a nice reflection, and that's something that I think is really key to get when you have the chance to get it. So about half of the photos, the reflection is pretty much just like a water line, and that goes across the entire image. So that's just basically my horizon line or my kind of center focal point, and that's where I choose to move my composition around. In these first 4 photos, it's pretty self-explanatory. The entire image is reflected across that horizon line. 2 of the images were taken in the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. Good name for it. One of the images was actually taken probably about half a mile away from the reflecting pool in another pond with I think they're willow trees reflecting into the pond. The last one was taken at a county park near me, and basically I got lucky with this reflection because it doesn't always look like this. The water is not always that reflective, and again, you just really decide about where you want that horizon line once you've taken the photo. So there's endless opportunities, but taking advantage of a good reflection is something that I really love. The other type of reflection is kind of when there is like a reflection within the photo. It's not the entire photo. With winter here, one thing that I've really noticed is that a lot of the smaller bodies of water were super reflective. Like the water was almost black, and so it offered a really nice reflection off of it. Now, most of the times when dealing with this, the reflection itself is not going to be like the subject of the photo. It's just going to enhance the photo. For example, with this winter snowy one, the tree really is that main subject, and the reflection is just enhanced. So my camera 100% cut me off, but it's fine. So next is the Winding Creek photo. The focus and the subject is not on the reflection itself, but the creek, and so it helps that the reflection is actually inside of the creek, but again, the reflection just adds to the winding creek and it doesn't make the entire photo. Lastly, this picture taken at Harriman State Park. absolutely not the key focus of the photo. The key focus of the photo really is just kind of like the two large tree trunks and the landscape and details above the actual water line, and the reflections in the bottom are just enhancement, adds more detail to the photo. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of composition are just lines. This has definitely been talked about, and realistically, if you've taken any kind of photography class, lines are something that are very harped upon when it comes to composing a photo. I did want to primarily talk about leading lines because that's what you're gonna see most, I think, when it comes to going out and shooting landscapes. At least that's what I've come across the most. Like, this is man-made, so I'm not gonna find this out in nature, these window lines. So the main thing is just like roads, paths, and water. That's kind of my go-to when it comes to out and about shooting and taking a leading line and what I want to use as my leading line. Starting off with like something like a road, typically I'll put that in the center of a photo. When it comes to a stream, same thing, center of the photo does really well. And then like sometimes you'll have lines that maybe work a little bit off center, but typically you'll see a leading line kind of in the center of a photo. So a few key ones that I want to go through, like I have a few road ones, post snowstorm, simple, just driving down the highway, clear leading line down the road, and then you see some of that nature and the beauty that I really wanted to capture along the side, but that road really gives you kind of a focal point for your eyes to go to, and then you can see the snow framing, the snowy trees framing up the side of the road. We were driving in Oregon, and clearly there were these kind of like cool mountainous features on the side, but there was a road running down it. Again, key focal point for your eyes to go to, and then you see the nature features around it, which is just another way to frame up your photo. Like, people might think it's basic. Here, after again another snowstorm, I loved the snow on the trees. I thought the snow on the ground was really cool and even piled up, but that center focal point being the road, and it gives your eyes something to follow. The next thing is water. So one is definitely like the Reflection Creek photo that I showed earlier when talking about reflections. Another is this photo that I took in Taiwan. Again, you have the mountain ranges, but if that body of water wasn't there, you wouldn't really have something to focus on. It would just be like green, but that body of water, and that's kind of like its own leading line, is something that really nicely divides the photo, gives you a focal point to focus on, and then have your eyes go out from there to look at the rest of the photo. And then lastly that I touched upon were trails. So again, something very popular when it comes to hiking. A lot of times you're gonna get a nice like trail shot. One thing that I really like about trail shots is I think they're so cool when you get the opportunity to have the trail as a leading line up to like a beautiful backdrop. So like some of these, you know, with the Grand Teton mountain range in the back, and then my sister and I hiking there. I had my brother take this very specific shot because I liked the way that the hiking trail was the leading line to that mountain range in the background. If I did it again, I would actually keep this as a vertical photo and not crop it to a square, because you have more of the top part above the mountains, so that that is more of a focal point as well. This mountain range that we hiked was in Montana, and this was on the like the top ridge section, so you can see it's just pretty wide open. Again, if I did this again, it would be a more wider angle shot. This one is one of the ones that, and it depends photo to photo. I actually have this leading line on the side because more of the like mountain range focal point was on the left side of the image, so I framed it up where I could include that leading line but also the mountain range. Last one that I'm gonna mention is this one from Creators of the Moon, and basically the leading line is the road. Offers this leading line to go right in between some of these like more subtle peaks that you see, and that is just gonna draw your attention to what I at the time, and still do think, is the main focal point is kind of like the more mountainous parts. Leading lines are super great out in nature. So I hope you guys enjoyed this very long and very rambly video of going through just some of my Instagram photos that I've taken and breaking down the compositions in them. And if you guys have any go-to compositions, I would love to hear about them. I wouldn't have thought to try having like the foreground out of focus, focusing on the background, if it weren't for the fact that I saw a few other photographers do that, whether it's on Instagram or on YouTube, and I was like, hey, that's a very cool perspective that I would not have thought of before. So I'd love to hear some of your favorite compositions down below and hear what you like about them, how you find them, especially if you are a primarily landscape photographer. So if you guys did enjoy this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy content like this on photography, whether it's film or digital, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Again, I'm doing my best to still put out YouTube videos as consistently as I can. So if you want, go ahead and check out my Instagram. I am trying to pick up posting back on there more regularly because it is a good way for me to keep in touch with a lot of my subscribers from YouTube who have now started following me on Instagram. So with that being said, I will see you all in my next video, and thank you guys for watching until the end.